Well, good morning. About time for us to get started here. Appreciate the opportunity to fill in for Tino as he is away this morning, but of course he'll be taking over the reins for the remainder of the time, I assume. This morning we're going to be talking about the book of Job, and my purpose this morning is really just to give you kind of an overview, an introduction to the book, and then when Tino gets back to really get more into it. So what as we go through and study the book, and several things that we'll talk about this morning, but again this morning just kind of explore the background of the book a little bit to kind of get a better understanding of some different ways to look at it. Some of the basic stuff we'll talk about, author and date, and who was Job, and when did he live, and those kinds of things. There's a lot of things that we don't know, quite frankly, and so we'll get into some of that as well. But we talk about this idea of suffering, some of the different themes that we'll cover a little bit, faith, God's sovereignty. So it's an important book, and if you're like me, then maybe you've read this book the same way that I have in the past, and that's I've read the first couple of chapters and the last couple of chapters, and then just been confused for the whole time in between. And to think, well, it starts out pretty good, it ends pretty good, so all's well that ends well, right? And that's kind of the book of Job. But there's really so much more to it. Some of the things that we learn about creation and how the Bible is good source material. Some of the evidence material that for the existence of God is in the book of Job, for example. So there's a lot that's in here, and we'll talk about that as we kind of go along here. One question to keep in mind, again, is kind of an overview, but to ask yourself, and I won't necessarily ask anybody to comment, unless you want to, certainly, but this idea of, has there ever been a time, and certainly we know this is true for many in here, but has there ever been a time of trial, of tribulation, persecution, of suffering, where you've questioned God, where you've thought to ask, why me? Why is this happening to me? And perhaps we all have had those moments of doing that, things that we've endured, things that we've gone through. And as we look at that, we can see other occasions in the Bible where people have sort of negotiated with God. You think about Abraham with reference to Sodom and Gomorrah. God, what if there's just 30 people or 25 people? That conversation that he has. Maybe we find ourselves in some cases like that. But especially when we're challenged, when things aren't going the way that we expect them to go, when we think that we've done everything right, we've followed God, we've done what we're supposed to do, and yet things don't work out the way that we think that they're supposed to. And that can be difficult, that can be challenging, that can be hard. It can be disappointing and discouraging, all of those things, all of those emotions that we go through from time to time. And so keep all of that in mind as we go along, not necessarily this morning, but as we go along through the study, to keep those ideas in mind, because those are the very questions that Job was asking, trying to figure some of those things out. Why is this happening to me? And as we go, we can see maybe why God was doing some of those things and allowing that to happen. But the theme, the idea of why do good people suffer, that is in Christian apologetics, that's one of the most common questions that people will ask. Is like, how can you say there's a God when there's so much suffering in the world? The question will come in different forms, but it's kind of that idea. And so understanding the question, having an answer to that question, is important in being ready to give an answer for the hope that's within us. So again, keep those kinds of things in mind as we go along through this. Some of the basics that we'll talk about a little bit: who wrote it and when. Well, basically, it varies widely as far as who actually wrote the book. The author is not mentioned. In many cases, we know we have good evidence. Either the author is stated in the book itself, or there's other very obvious indications of who the author is. Job's not that way. We just don't really have anything specific. Scholars, some articles that I read, some things that I looked at, most would look at it in terms of the language that is used there, and not just the literal language, which is mostly Hebrew, but there's some, I believe, some spattering of Aramaic or some expressions that have an Aramaic influence in there. So, you know, and the poetry that's in there, different things, but that's usually what scholars will look at, since an author is not specifically named, and again, we don't know specifically who it was, but to try to pinpoint maybe a time frame and that kind of thing. Some have suggested that maybe it was Moses that wrote it. Others have suggested that maybe Solomon or somebody during his time frame, since it is included as one of the wisdom books, along with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Then some have said, well, this book may have been written around the same time frame and so forth. But again, and there are those that look at it because of the language that's there, because of the phrases, the words, you know, people who study those things and who have knowledge of those things. A lot of people think that maybe it was the post-Babylonian era, that maybe it was an individual who was in Judea at the time. And again, there's some references within the book that lead them to believe that. But after the exiles had come back, so like we've been studying in our class and just finished up, so it would have been probably after that period of Zerubbabel, and then Nehemiah, and then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. So after that period of time, it's interesting if you look at that, you know, from 540 to 330 BCE. Now you're getting into that 400 years of silence period, right? You're starting to get into that period as well. So that's always intriguing to me when you think about 400 years of silence and how loud those 400 years were from a historical perspective. There was a lot going on during that time frame. But again, there's some suggestion and some evidence that maybe it was written during that time frame. So again, bottom line, we don't know. We don't know who it was. We don't know exactly when it was, but the evidence suggests maybe during that time frame there. And as I said before, part of the wisdom literature, along with Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. One of the things to keep in mind, too, with the book of Job, where you have in the book of Proverbs, it's more of a, I forget how they looked at it, but almost kind of a cause and effect. You know, when you read through Proverbs, a lot of times you'll see where, you know, the righteous man this and the evil man, you know, this. And it's very clear that, you know, good things are going to happen to the righteous man and bad things are going to happen to the evil man and the wicked man. And one of the challenges of the book of Job is that really doesn't seem to be the case. There's a concept or an idea called, see if I pronounce this right, retributive justice, I think is what it is. And that's the idea that we see in the book of Proverbs, which is that good people are always going to be rewarded and evil people are always going to be punished. You know, that's the retribution for their wickedness. But that's not what's happening in Job, is it? And so it's a challenge to that idea that is so clearly stated in other places and that. So again, it's a challenge to read and to understand because of that. Let's talk about Job for a minute. And again, if you've got some thoughts or ideas about that or about him from your reading, certainly contribute to that. When you think about Job, who was Job? Job chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and shunned evil. 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. Job was a man who was blameless. as you get further down in there, and God, is talking to Satan, and he says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And talks about him being blameless and righteous and a good man. He was upright, feared God, certainly a man of means. We see that. And so Job was a good man. I think we can say that. And as you go through and read the story, we see that's the case. He is a man who cared about his family. Notice in verse 5 how he offers sacrifices for his family. Not only for himself, but for his family, for his children. Notice that Job says in verse 5, it may be that my sons have sinned, excuse me, that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did regularly. It was his regular practice to do that. And not because he knew certain things that his children were doing, but on the chance that they were. I think it says a lot about his character in that. As a parent, I have to ask myself, how often do I pray for my children? And when I pray for them, am I just praying for their prosperity? Or
meditate upon, because it's a very deep thought. But we have the like parallel in the New Testament regarding marriage, that if it's an unbelieving spouse, that the believer can pray for that unbelieving, and thereby that unbelieving can be sanctified. So I think those are two good parallels to really consider.
we can have an impact, right? Is it 1 Peter 3 about the example of the wife and how that can be good and to help her husband? There's some things there. So certainly there's a lot that we can do for our families, for others. I mean, we're not limited to just praying for our families, certainly. So a lot that we can do. But again, regarding the character of Job and who he was, Ezekiel 14 and James 5, he's mentioned as righteous. So even in other places, the New Testament writers refer to him as a righteous man. And so we see that as well. And one of the things that I've thought about, have you ever thought about Job and compared, we're all familiar with the worthy woman of Proverbs 31, and many of you I'm sure have studied that in depth, and all the different qualities and characteristics that are there. But in Job 31, there are a number of things, and let me just kind of give you that list there. When you look at Job 31, chapters 1 through 40, he's referred to as being morally pure, just, a good husband, kind, not a false worshiper, loving, hospitable, sincere, a good steward. This is the guy, again, that God would say, have you considered my servant Job? There's none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. So sometimes as men, just talking to the men for a second, the ladies have Proverbs 31 and to kind of look at, and sometimes wonder, well, where's our example? Well, here's an example for us. Here's a worthy man to look at in Job. And so I think that's something that we can do with that. And just coincidentally, it's Job 31, like it's in Proverbs 31 there. But that is worth our time to study and take a look at. Any thoughts as far as Job, or things that you recognize about him or his character? All right. When and where did Job live? Again, the bottom line is we don't know for sure. What the evidence suggests from the text itself and from other studies is that as far as the time period, for example, in Job 42 and verse 16, so at the end of the book, it talks about how he lived an additional 140 years. And so that's just one clue that might lead us to suggest that would have been earlier, perhaps during the patriarchal period, perhaps even before that, some have suggested, because of the long life that he has. We know that at some point those long lives that we read about in Genesis, that all of that kind of came to a close there. 120 years or 100 years, that kind of thing. But we don't see men living for many, many years after. And I don't know that, I don't recall it, and if it does say it somewhere, somebody let me know. I don't recall that we know his age at the time of these events. But again, at the end of the book, it's 140 more years after that. And so, however old he was, he had several children, there's a lot, so, he probably wasn't a guy in his 20s. So, I mean, it's quite possible then, let's just throw a number and say he may have been in his 50s or 60s. So now you've got 140. So Job could have been 200 years old. So again, that length of time for a life would suggest something much earlier rather than much later. Even Abraham and Isaac and Jacob weren't living that long at that time. He was living in the land of Uz, again, not a place that we know where it's at. Some have suggested possibly that might have been outside of Israel, and if we're talking about being of the patriarchal period or even a little bit before that, before Abraham, Israel was not even a nation yet, but possibly in Edom or northern Arabia. All of the livestock would, the way that wealth was measured back then. So again, there's no cities mentioned. There's none of that. So possibly more of a nomadic type of person with all the things that he had there. But again, not a whole lot is known about that land other than how it's mentioned there. As we said before, perhaps a contemporary of Abraham, talking 2000, 1800 BCE, or again, even earlier than that could have been. As we mentioned, the long life. Notice also the patriarchal culture. There's no mention of a priesthood. In fact, Job himself, as the one offering sacrifices, is fulfilling that role for his family. There's no mention of a Mosaic law, no mention of any of those things. It was interesting, and I was talking to Darlene about it yesterday. We know that God's people, the Hebrews, had a very special relationship with God, but there were other people who had at least a recognition and an acknowledgement of God. And the one that we were talking about that I thought about was Moses' uncle Jethro, or Ruel, I think was the other name for him. He was considered a priest of God, right? So there was, and he was living in Midian. So there's an understanding, there's an acknowledgement that's there. And so even though Job doesn't appear to be, for a lot of good reasons, a Hebrew in the same sense that maybe Abraham and others were, he certainly has a knowledge of God. There's recognition of God. I mean, there's conversations with God. So there's something that's special there in that, as far as the culture and the time frame that he lived in. So again, all of that suggests really that patriarchal period or even before that. And really that period runs, if you think about it, that period really runs from Adam all the way up to the law, I would suppose. Or, you had fathers being heads of household or heads of tribes. They were handling in terms of sacrifices and guiding and leading the religious practices until the law came and the Levitical priesthood came into play. All right.
John?
Yes.
Just a couple of things. It says that he was the greatest of all of the men of the East, which suggests to me that he's probably not in what we think of as Canaan or the Holy Land, or that probably maybe more east than that, maybe in what we think of as Babylon or Persia or Iran or Iraq, that area, because it talks about all the men of the East,
Yeah.
Which might be suggestive of where he lived. But the other thing is that even though he wasn't, well, we don't know what nationality or ethnicity or whatever you want to call it that he was. The Jews knew about him because God told Ezekiel that if the land was not a good land, if they weren't following God, that even though Noah or Job or Daniel lived among them, that they couldn't deliver the land. And so when he's mentioned in Ezekiel, that to me again suggests that the Jews knew about him, whether how much or how that came about or any of that kind of thing. We don't know, but there's that suggestion that they knew about Job, and it was important to them to know about their forefathers or those who came before. And so, again, it doesn't give us any specifics, but it does kind of be suggestive of some things.
Yeah, no, and that's an excellent point, because the story of Job seems to have lasted for a long time, perhaps prior to when it was actually written down. And that's a suggestion that's made with some of the scholars, is that, of course, a lot of oral tradition amongst a lot of the cultures, and that's something that when you think about oral traditions, cultures that have oral tradition, I don't know that we fully get the concept, because we know how our memories fail, and so we automatically assume that those other cultures, the stories would change over time. In those type of cultures, it was, you learned the stories and the specifics, and it was extremely important. And there, you were trained in, just as people were trained to write things down, these people were trained to memorize those things and to learn those stories. And so there's a lot of, there wasn't a lot of change over time that we would be used to in terms of just relying on memory. It was a highly important function for them. That was their, we talk about oral histories, that was their history. And so there was great significance placed upon understanding that. So Job seems to be a story that would have lasted for hundreds of years, perhaps even before it was actually then finally written down, by some of the exiles. Yes, ma'am.
Just a parallel here about being from the east to follow Frank's point, which I think is a very good point. At the time Jesus was born, the three men that came, the wise men, were from the east.
Yeah.
And so to use your point of the learned stories, I think connects, it kind of gels, what the two of you are saying to me.
Yeah.
That it was probably outside the patriarchal Holy Land, as we use the term sometimes.
Most of the Jews that went into exile, did they stay or did they go home?
Stay.
Most of them stayed. So all of the knowledge of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and all of those things, when the whole synagogue system was created, they were all over the place. Sometimes we think, as we see, just to jump to the New Testament, and we see Paul going from city to city, what was his custom? To go into the synagogue, right, on the Sabbath, and to have conversations with people. Paul didn't create those synagogues. They'd been there for a long time, and a lot of that came out of from not the exiles that went back home, but the ones that stayed. A lot of that came from that. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I know even in the Oriental culture, the 7 people shown on the ark really became, from that culture, a story learned, to use your term.
Yeah.
So the stories that were learned, and I think that's an excellent term to plant in our minds and hearts. Really, we need to think more deeply about that.
Absolutely. All right. So again, where he lived, and Frank, that's a good point. I've heard that suggested as well. You think about Ur of the Chaldees, maybe a city named Uz, that kind of thing. And again, that's certainly possible. When you think about the outline of the book and how it's laid out, there's maybe a couple of different ways to look at that. But for the most part, it lays out pretty obviously. You've got what we might call the prologue, and this is the setting. What's the situation here? Because we kind of, I suppose with any story, you have to start somewhere. And so with Job, we're starting. Job is already alive. He's already got a family. He's already got great wealth. So we're kind of coming into the middle, if you will, of Job's life and what's going on. And we're presented with this situation. Here's Satan, and he's having conversations with God, and all of this begins to transpire. And so we see what God allows to happen to Job, to his family, to his prosperity, to all of that. Satan challenging his culture. Does Job serve God for nothing? That kind of thing. The challenge that's there, and how all of this impacts Job, and the beginning of feeling the pressure and the burden of the suffering that he has. And so all of that's taking place there. Of course, Job's friends arrive there in chapter 2 as well. You remember you have the response from his wife, but curse God and die. So there's a lot that's happening in those first 2 chapters there to really set the stage for all of this that follows. And then the majority of the book, you've got these dialogues. So you've got the 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and this back and forth between them and Job. And of course, one of the common themes from them is this idea that it's basically Job's fault. Job, if you're suffering, then it's your fault. You remember, I think it's in John chapter 9, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's in John chapter 9 where there was the man who was blind, who God healed, or Jesus healed of his blindness, but the Pharisees were like, what did this man do to be born blind? And Jesus basically tells them, nothing. I mean, it's not, he's not blind because he's a sinner. But that was the common idea. Again, back to that retributive principle, that idea that, hey, if something bad happens to you, it's because you deserved it. And that's just not always the case, which again begs the big broader question, why do bad things happen to good people sometimes? But you've got all these different speeches that happen there in that section. And then there's a young man named Elihu who comes in, chapters 32 through 37. While you've got the 3 friends that are condemning Job, and Job firing back and saying, wait a minute, but that's, you're saying I'm this wicked man. I'm not a wicked man. And he's right. He's not. He's a righteous man. Even God said that about him. But Elihu comes in and he condemns Job's self-righteousness and the failure of the friends really to do that. He emphasizes God's justice and his discipline, exalts God's greatness and sovereignty. And so there's a lot of good things that this younger man comes in to tell these older and wiser men that are having that back and forth. But of course, some of the most exciting parts of the book are what follows then, where the Lord begins to respond. As he comes, his voice comes out of the whirlwind and the speeches that he makes. And that's where a lot of the book, it sort of comes to a climax, really, there. Because all of these people have been speaking about a bunch of things that they think they know, but they really don't. And God comes in to set the record straight on what's what.
The Lord has said, enough of this nonsense.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. And not only does he set the 3 friends straight, but of course he has some things to say directly to Job as well, and some challenges and questions to him in all of that. And then of course finally it wraps up with Job's restoration, which again is kind of a happy ending to an otherwise tragic tale. Any questions or thoughts as far as kind of how the book is laid out, any of those kinds of things?
How do you feel about Elihu being the author of the book?
Yeah, I've never thought about that. That's a possibility. Never thought about that. Yeah, one of the articles I read, and again goes back to kind of the text itself, seems to be somebody who was very intelligent. Their use of language, the vocabulary, all those kinds of things. The textual critics, the textual scholars look at that and say this wasn't written by a 4th grader kind of thing. Which Elihu could very well have been that person. So, yeah, that's an interesting thought.
If I'm not mistaken, this is the longest written discourse of God in the Bible.
That's probably true. Just quickly thinking in my mind, I can't think of another time where there's a longer conversation. The conversation he has with Abraham go, but it's not this long. Yeah, that's a good point, Renee. George?
I read a little bit in a commentary, and it's talking about the first couple of chapters prose, and the last few verses were prose, and all the rest of it was poetry. And I was wondering how we may not appreciate that because all the translations probably different, but I don't know that I'd appreciate it either.
Well, yeah, and that's, that's a good thought. For us, and I don't know how everybody else thinks about it, when we think of poetry, we're thinking roses are red, violets are blue, right? And clearly that's not what is in here, but I am by no means a scholar in any shape or form as far as Hebrew literature, but there is a lot of what is considered Hebrew poetry, and some of the literary devices, and that's one of the ways that textual scholars can have some understanding about a book and even understanding about what the meaning is and so forth, but it's to be able to see, because sometimes, and maybe you've come across it, sometimes you're reading a verse, and even regardless of the translation that you have sometimes, and it's just kind of hard to understand, or why certain words are used in place of other words, or double words, there's all kinds of different literary devices, but that's part of that Hebrew style, that again, I'm not a scholar of it at all, but those are things that are indicative of that Hebrew style, so that we can understand that, or Jews that would have read this, Hebrews that would have read this, would probably have a deeper understanding maybe than even we can, because of the language and that literary style. Yeah. So what's this book about? Let's take the rest of our time to kind of think about some of these themes that we've kind of touched on a little bit already. But, we've got the story of a righteous man. And again, that's stated over and over. And it's important to understand that here is a good man that bad things are happening to. And it's certainly something that we can all relate to, right? So I think that's helpful. Sometimes we may see characters in the Bible and, the bad guys are getting what's coming to them, and the good guys are getting rewarded. And maybe it's hard to relate to that sometimes. Everybody's got their own story in here of what their life's journey has been. And sometimes it's easier to relate. Sometimes it's harder to relate to some of the folks that we see in the Bible. But I think there's a universal sense where we can all relate to Job. Maybe not to the extent, God forbid that the extent of his suffering has happened to any of us, but certainly in the general idea and sense of that we have all had to endure something in our lives, and the loss, the pain, all of those kinds of things. And again, it's not because he did anything wrong, because he didn't. But it's part of this divine test that God allows to happen. And that's where the challenge is why would God allow that? I don't know about you, but when you see a guy who is seemingly doing everything right, I look at my own life, and I aspire to be as righteous as Job. When you look at all the things that he did. And yet God still allowed these things to happen to him. And why? And what does that mean to me? If God allows this to happen to him, what would God allow to happen to me? And would I be able to, to say, would I be, when not that my wife would, but if my wife came to me and said, curse God and die, would I be going, yeah, that kind of thing? Or would I be like Job and remain faithful in that? So again, it's a challenging book because of that. Yes, sir.
And I think too, we sometimes think of ourselves, I don't know,
Do we sometimes think of ourselves as making all the right choices? Well, if I'd been in Job's shoes, I would have done like he have done.
feeling sorry for
Or feeling sorry, yeah.
That's what it's-
Yeah, well, yeah, we certainly do that. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I think it's kind of clear too that when someone is suffering, one of the lessons to us, if we're not suffering, is people who are suffering don't want to be chastised or discouraged further or pointed out that they're in a time of suffering. They need to be encouraged and uplifted. So there are times that I think the lesson for us is when those opportunities present themselves, we need to be positive and uplifting and encouraging. And the other one, I think, that I notice in Job is that even when his friends were doing that, they're discouraging him. And he kind of alludes to it, but he does it in the end. He realizes that when we're not in those suffering situations, we're really thinking much clearer and more logical about our faith. We might question our faith, or we might question God when we are in those times of trouble, but the faith is really seeing you through. When you come out of it, you do have the lesson learned, you do have the reference to go back to when someone else is going through the same thing. But it's, you're really thinking logically, and you can refer back to those times with wisdom once you get through it. So to be patient and long-suffering with God, to suffer with Him, to suffer in faith is our job. And then when we make it through that, we can be a light to others.
Absolutely. I want to say 2 Corinthians chapter 1 that talks about, we're able to comfort those. The God of all comfort comforts us, and we're able to use that same comfort with which we have been comforted to comfort others in their suffering. And so there's absolutely, there's purpose, there's intent, there's value in our suffering, because it's gonna come, right? I mean, it's not an if, it's a when. And so we have to deal with that when it does. So the book, again, exploring those deep questions about suffering, about justice. Do we want, I've heard it said, do we want God's justice? Sometimes we think we want justice. You got all the people out there hollering for justice. We want justice for other people, but we want mercy. You're right, but we want mercy for ourselves, don't we? We want mercy and grace for ourselves. It's some deep questions about faith in here, because certainly faith is what's being challenged. And again, God's sovereignty. It's a challenge to think, especially in this book, as we see what God allows, to think every decision that God makes is always right. It's always right, no matter what it is. And whether you're having a discussion with somebody about, God telling His people to kill every man, woman, child, donkey, whatever, as they're conquering the land. And that's a challenge sometimes to think, why would God want them to do that? Aren't some of these people innocent, and those kinds of things. But every decision that God makes, every choice He makes, it is right. And again, in our human understanding, that can be a challenge to accept.
So when something bad happens, we tend to blame God or question God, and it's always a focus on God, which isn't bad. But Satan is alive and well.
Absolutely.
And all of these bad things come from Satan, not from God.
But yeah,
But God uses these things for our good so that we can learn from it and lean on Him during those times.
yeah, and you're absolutely right. Whenever something bad happens, there's a tornado, there's a hurricane, there's whatever natural disasters. Like, why did God do this? Or some sort of tragedy, or whatever the case may be. But you're right. Everybody wants to go and to blame God for something bad happening. The devil never gets any credit, right? I mean, when's the last time the devil got credit for doing things? And nobody wants to think about him. Yeah.
Well, to go along with what Renee just said, at the end, Job realized that God was really the only one that stood with him, was his only friend, and the only one that saw him through the whole thing. So even though his friends were there, they were not giving him the encouragement that he needed, but God really did see him through
Yeah.
to the end and bless him.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
The And that's why it's very good that we end our prayers with thy will be done. And really mean that. Really knowing in our mind and our heart with the understanding, not just wisdom alone, but with the understanding that God knows best.
Isn't that the big, if you think about all the ways that we're challenged as Christians, isn't that truly the biggest challenge? The biggest challenge is not temptation to sin. It's not anything that's out in the world. That's really not the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge that we face is submitting our will to his will. Because if we do that, the other stuff takes care of itself. Ed, did you? Yeah.
Yeah, the world, like you said, it doesn't give, the devil doesn't give Satan credit. Hardly ever, really, I guess. And for those of us that are old enough to remember the comedian Flip Wilson, and he had a skit, part of his routine always, he'd go through this stuff. The devil made me do it.
Yeah.
And it was supposed to be funny. The devil made me do it. In other words, it's not real, it's just the devil made me do it. That's the world.
We used to hear that back in the day, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
People would say it whether in jest or sometimes not in jest or whatever, but you don't even hear that now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not even a thing now. Some of there's about 4 key themes I think that we look in here. Again, the idea of human suffering, why do good people suffer? That's kind of some of the questions that we'll look at and try to answer. The sovereignty of God. And again, if God is sovereign, then I'm not, which means he's in charge and I'm not in charge. He gets to make all the rules and he gets all the say. Jesus in Matthew 28, what did he say? All authority has been given to me. If he's got all authority, how much did he leave for me? Zip. And again, that's a tough thing, because if he makes all the decisions, can we justifiably challenge his justness on anything, his righteousness?
Well, and Jesus very well magnified that when he said in the Gospel of John, I think it's chapters 14 and 16, I was sent by the Father.
Yeah.
And one of those chapters said, God is greater than I am. So he is at that apex. They're one.
Yeah.
They're united. But God has the ultimate authority, the Father.
Yeah, the Father does. And Jesus submitted himself to the will of the Father. 1 Corinthians 11 lays that out for us. The Father, the Son, and
Right.
so forth, the headship. Faith and doubt, these are, again, another big theme as we're going through the book, to keep this in mind. How do we respond when life seems unfair? How does our suffering refine our faith? You think about whether it's in 1 Peter or other places, all the epistles written to people who were enduring persecution and suffering. Hebrews chapter 10, you have need of endurance, he says, towards the end of that. And even after talking about some of the things that they had been through, that the very section where in Hebrews 10 where he's talking about assembling together and stirring one another up to love and good works, that's within the same context of talking to people who had been severely persecuted. And at the end of that, after verses 24 and 25 there, then he's talking about the endurance that they need. Well, assembling together is part of that, as like Tara was saying, part of that mutual encouragement that we give each other. So all those things are in there. And again, the idea God is worthy of our trust. When we begin to doubt, we need to look at that. Of course, the limits of our human wisdom. God challenges Job time and again. Were you there when I did this? Where were you when I did this? Do you understand about this? Can you make this? And the fact is, we're so small and insignificant and unable when compared with what God is able to do and to think and create and all of those things. And yet the message of grace is, even with how insignificant we are, yet God considered us. He didn't send Christ for the antelope or for the mountains or the rivers or for any other created thing, but he sent Christ for us. One last little thing here in the last 30 seconds here, and I just want to throw this out there. Is Job a parallel to the Bible story? I've thought about this, and so I just want to throw this out to you, where you have a beginning with you have blessings, you have fellowship. Again, Job's in a right spot, right relationship with God. He's doing all the right things. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, everything's looking really good, kind of hunky-dory. And then you have this middle where there's struggle and suffering and sin and questions about that. And a large part of the Bible is about man's struggle and God through Christ bringing man back into that. And then the turning point, God's Word, the redemption, and of course in the end you get to Revelation, and you've got all of the great blessings there. So as we study through the book, think about the parallels to the entire story, and how does that change what the book means to us then, when we think about that? What more can we learn about our own salvation and the meaning behind that from the book of Job? Thank you.